I am recording the next month's videos. You will not be in them. Now is your chance to say something.
Trump. Trump sucks. If you voted for him, get the f off this channel. We don't want you. Bye.
I'll censor the F word, but otherwise, yeah, I'll keep that in there.
Yes!
You know, there's this funny thing that D&D content creators do, specifically here on this site, YouTube. We tend to subject each of the dungeon masters which will play their games on camera into different subsections. We'll like divide them into what category they fit in.
Here are the 7 types of DM in Dungeons & Dragons, or other tabletop games.
How do the most famous DMs in the world keep their games fair and balanced? Well, let's check a bunch out, starting with Chris Perkins.
Different ways Dungeon Masters plan for sessions. The prepared. I got my dice, I got my notes, I got an encounter if needed, and I reviewed everything yesterday. What a stress-free day. The unprepared. Well, looks like I'm winging it.
I have a game coming up and I haven't prepared for it like at all, and I have no time to prepare for it. Oh shit, when is it? In 3 weeks. Right. Okay. If I don't have a solution to literally every single possible outcome that the party could ever come up with, and I don't have every NPC's backstories completely fleshed out, including a family tree for all of their extended family, and if I don't account for literally every single object and every single square meter of every possible traversable area in this entire world, and if I don't— What the fuck? My God.
Side note, did she dye her hair different colors to play these 2 different characters? Which means she recorded this at totally separate times. I'm not even mad. I'm mostly just impressed. I could barely convince myself to get off my lazy butt and record a skit normally. So, you know, props to you. Anyways.
You'll see this all over the place. People will be like, Matthew Mercer is this type of DM, while Brennan Lee Mulligan is this type of DM, and Bria Iyengar is this type of DM, so on, so on, so on. And I'm not casting criticism at them because 1, I've kind of done that same thing on my channel, so it would be really hypocritical of me to say that. And 2, I'm going to be doing it in this video too, so, you know, let's just get that out of the way. However, I want to go deeper than just that, because it's not just what type of Dungeon Master are you, it's what kind of game do you want to run. I think subconsciously we all know that every single Dungeon Master is going to run their games in different ways. Like, yeah, of course we know that. But because many people got into the game through watching live plays, and because D&D 5e was so popularized through live plays, etc., many people learned one way to run the game, and that's all they did. But before the popularization of D&D 5e, Dungeons & Dragons was run in many different ways. And it really came down to, instead of what live plays did you watch, it came down to more of what media did you consume? And media tells stories in very different ways. And this all leads me to this thought process that the DM is basically the narrator of your story, right? Well, did you know that there's more than just one kind of narrator in a story? See, anybody who studied literature or media will know this fact, but a lot of people aren't aware of it because it's just not common information unless it's one of your hobbies or special interests, as it is in my case. Narrators can come in many different forms, whether it is the omniscient narrator or whether it is something similar. The thing is they all basically can be broken down into one single category of what kind of information do they ration to the audience. See, omniscient narrators will know everything, and they will tell the audience everything. What is that character thinking? What is that character thinking? What is that character thinking? Everybody gets to know.
All of his co-workers were gone. What could it mean? Stanley decided to go to the meeting room. Perhaps he had simply missed a memo. No matter how hard Stanley looked, he couldn't find a trace of his co-workers.
You'll be able to tell what's going on in the world, and even though a character's lineage may go down so far that the character themselves doesn't know, the audience knows because the narrator knows. And so you get characters like, well, Tom Bombadil from Lord of the Rings. Tolkien went very in-depth on Tom Bombadil with things that were not necessary to the story, and the readers knew, but the characters didn't. That is an omniscient narrator, but it's just one kind. I think most people assume the Dungeon Master is the omniscient narrator because they know everything in the world, because they're creating it, right? But that's not true, because you don't tell everything about the world to the players, the audience. And that is truly the interesting thing. Because we've gotten so used to watching live plays, where the Dungeon Master is the narrator not just for the players, but an audience as a whole, most of us don't realize that we ourselves are just dungeon masters to the players at our table, who are both the characters, but also the audience. And that's interesting. Now, I know there's probably a lot of people at home of a older variety, hi old guard, who are rolling their eyes and saying, oh my god, these kids, of course. But let's be real, the majority of the TTRPG community got into D&D within the past several years. That's statistically backed up. So a lot of people may not have thought this way. I know I haven't. I'm not gonna sit here and pretend that I have all of this knowledge that I don't. It's something I've been thinking about a lot. And so it got me thinking, what kind of narrator are you at your table? And which one's going to work best for your characters, the readers, as well as the audience? Well, there are many types of narrators. Generally, you could break them down into a few different vague categories. The first being one thing that I mentioned earlier, the third-person omniscient narrator, the one who talks about things from a detached point of view. They will say, so-and-so did this as they walked into the room and saw so-and-so. So-and-so then stood up and talked to so-and-so about so-and-so. They know everything and talk about it as if they're reading it from afar, up above, seeing everything that's happening, or in the room as a fly on the wall, just telling you what's happening in the story. The interesting thing about this is it's not from any one person's point of view, and that might be obvious for a D&D game, but it can go beyond that. Yes, how many times have we told things that are happening to the players because their characters are there witnessing it? But how many times are there things going on in the world elsewhere that the players are not there for? They can still receive that information. Because again, the characters are different than the audience. The audience being the people at the table. So you can tell them, yes, the evil BBEG is having this interesting, very cool conversation on the side that your characters aren't there for. You can act it out for them, tell them. Essentially, it's like an after credit scene or, you know, just general exposition. That is a very valid way of playing the game, and Abria Iyengar actually does this very well in quite a few of the games that she's run. Specifically, the one that I've seen the most often that it was employed, and to be fair, I haven't seen a lot of Abria because it's kind of difficult to get a hold of a lot of her campaigns online without paywalls. Regardless, the one that I've seen that she has done this the most in is when she guest starred on Critical Role as their DM. And yeah, no, she did a great job of employing this technique.
The rain pours as the weather worsens in Iman. And slowly, through the weather, footsteps are heard, and Posca stands in front of her warehouse. She walks in, sees the corpses, the destruction. And then she sees the door at the back of the warehouse open, and a box pried open. And at that point, she turns, and into a small sigil tattooed on the inside of her wrist, she speaks 3 simple words. Burn it down. And across town, in the upper slums, the penthouse is set ablaze.
Now, you don't just do this willy-nilly, because why would you share all that information with your players? Well, the real reason is, the reason you want to share that information is to build dramatic irony or stakes. To let them know, hey, this is going on over here. Something big is happening, and your characters might not know it, but you do, and you could start getting excited about it. You could start wondering what's going on. You can employ this technique in order to build mystery and suspense. You can introduce a cloaked figure who the players don't know, and only later down the line do they realize that was their favorite NPC in that scene, who was just in disguise, and he's been betraying them the whole time. See, it can be employed for some very cool, suspenseful, fun things. Or, like I said, dramatic irony. One of the characters might be about to make a huge mistake, and then you can share this outside information with them through another scene that then puts that huge mistake into a totally different context. But the characters don't know that. Just the players do. Now, you do have to be careful with this, because obviously if you have characters or players who are, prone to metagaming, yeah, this isn't gonna work so well. It's more of a narrative-focused game, which I think Abria Iyengar does incredibly well. And so therefore, you're only going to want to bring this to the table if you have a narrative-focused game. And that's why I say that each of these types of narrators are only good for specific types of games, and you have to figure out which one you are. So let's move on to another one, the third-person subjective narrator. Now, the subjective narrator is interesting because they convey the thoughts, feelings, and opinions of one or more characters from their point of view. The best way that I could describe this is anybody who's watched Robbie Damon on Critical Role, or pretty much any character he's ever played in a TTRPG ever. Robbie does this interesting thing where he doesn't necessarily act out all of the actions of what's going on. A lot of the times the players at the Critical Role table, because they are voice actors and are used to using their voice to explain how they're feeling, will just do that. They'll act out a scene, and you could tell through the subtext of what it is that they're saying and how they're saying it, how their characters are feeling. Robbie doesn't do that. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I find it really intriguing when he does do it. Because what he does is he will explain the context, the feelings, and the emotions of his character before taking an action many times. And I think that this is an effective technique. If you're somebody who doesn't feel comfortable acting out your character's actions, this is a great technique to still communicate that roleplay well.
And, Dorian feels flushed. He feels a rush of emotions. He feels passion, and he feels confusion, and he's red and hot in the face, and he feels the feelings of lust and burden and guilt. And he lets them all go, and he just pulls you in so close, tight to his ribs, and sort of cups his hand over your head and holds you there.
Tell them, my character is going to lift up his sword, but he's just not certain if he wants to do this. He's feeling very conflicted about this fight, and so DM, I would actually like to roll at disadvantage, or DM, I would like to not attack for this turn. See, that's a good way of doing it. In fact, I've done something similar in the past. I've once had a character who was traumatized and didn't use his main weapon. I've told the story before, the Artificer D'Artagnan. And when I described the first time that he chose not to use his weapon, I acted it out. I had his hand shaking and then said, I dropped the weapon and I don't use it. I could have easily just described, he looks down at his hand and it's shaking a little bit and he realizes he doesn't want to use this weapon, and so he drops it and pulls out his sword instead. That works just as well, just through the inflection of your voice. You don't even have to act anything out. So it is a great way of playing a character, but as a DM, this is also interesting because you're supposed to be the objective narrator of the story, not the subjective narrator. So how do you do it as a DM? I wouldn't, not necessarily. Just play the DM and play it through the eyes of the NPCs. And if you want to talk about them and narrate them subjectively from that NPC's point of view for that time, that's fine. But you really do need to remain objective. I don't think there's a way to effectively do this, honestly, just as yourself, as a DM. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. But that does lead to the third type of narrator then, if that's the case and that's how you're going to do things. And that would be the third person objective narrator. And this one I find to be my cup of tea and probably a lot of people's cup of tea, just because of the way that D&D has evolved over the years. Now, this type of narrator gives an unbiased point of view in order to achieve neutrality. It's typical of journalistic text, or basically Matthew Mercer. I mean, Matt is extremely good at just remaining unbiased and objective. He will rule in one way or another, generally not towards the players or the villains. He just plays the game as it is. Does he bend rules? Sure, absolutely. They all do. Does he occasionally do things just for the sake of comedy? Yeah, I mean, why wouldn't you? But at the end of the day, he's just running the game as it's meant to be played. The villains try to kill the heroes are attempting to overcome the villains, they are playing D&D, it's a war game, it's a story, he's just objective about it. He does not try to lean one way or the other. Unlike Abria, who will oftentimes lean towards people and give them large advantages on things she finds cool storytelling-wise.
Because I want to try something.
Okay.
And I'm going to take a piece out, and I'm just going to touch it to one of the pieces on her body, and then see if I can make a connection. Can I pull a string from the can I continue this connection that she has?
Make a spell attack roll for me.
18. Because I don't know what my spell attack is.
Is that an 18 on the dice?
Yes.
Oh shit, okay. You reach out with like a little shard of the residuum and you touch it. Then you kind of quirk your head and you tap it like a tuning fork. A very specific clear tone emerges from it. And you're able to pull and you feel something catch as you create a new tether.
It is a perfectly viable way to play either way, but this one does tend to be the most, I would say, typical way of running a D&D game, and there's nothing wrong with that. This is how I tend to run my games, and I find it more fun this way, but it's not necessarily for every table. So if you're having a hard time DMing and you find yourself falling into this typical category, maybe look at the rest, see if there's something else there. Which actually does lead to another point of view, which I kind of forgot to mention, but there are more narrators. I'm sort of, going off the top of my head here as I look at my list on my teleprompter, please don't hate me. And that would be the second person view. That would be when the narrator refers to things as you, as if you were a character within the story, which you may think, hey, isn't that also how most people play D&D? And the answer is yes. The truth is, most of the time people will hop between the second person view as well as other types. But the second person view is uniquely interesting because it requires you to look specifically at the characters only. A lot of the times when you're narrating in this form, you will only address the characters. You're not players at the table. You're in this world. You are asking people to fully envelop yourself into it. And this is fun. I've even heard stories once upon a time of a DM who put up a screen in front of themselves. I know, weird, right? A DM screen. But I mean literally like a curtain so people couldn't even see them. Now, I don't like that because I personally like to interact with my players, but it was a very interesting form of just being the narrator of the world, the god, the voice behind the curtain. And that is, I honestly think, a cool way of doing things. I personally wouldn't do it, but I do think it adds a level of immersion that none of the other narration techniques would. And so if this is something you haven't done or you find interesting, I think it's worth looking into and seeing if maybe you might want to do something similar to that. But of course, this all leads to the question, how do you choose the right narrator for your story? What story do you players want to tell? How cinematic is the story? How personal is it? How do you convey emotion, and how do people convey emotions to you? Well, there is no right answer. There's only what story you want to tell next. The truth is that each of these techniques, while I sit here and ask what kind of DM are you, it's more of what game are you running? Because you might narrate one way one time and another way another time. It might be based on the very system that you're running. Many systems encourage you to run the omniscient narrator or the second person view narrator. There are so many different ways of doing it and deciding what you want to do. So honestly, I think it's just a question to ask at the session 0. And I think it's one that doesn't get talked about a lot, but really kind of should. I mean, it's crucial to storytelling. We shouldn't just assume what information we're going to get, and yet we don't think about it. Because ultimately, I think people just figure it out as they go along. So hopefully this just provided context and clues on where you might want to go next and how to run your game next the best. So go out into the world, make it your own. Don't forget to play your role, and don't forget to like, subscribe, all that stuff. I think I messed up my intro. I messed up my intro. I messed intro up my. Do you guys smell toast?